While James Watt was credited with inventing the low-pressure steam engine, the high-pressure steam engine was developed by an Englishman from Cornwall named Richard Trevithick, who applied it to a steam locomotive at the turn of the 19th century, giving him credit for the first effective steam locomotive. His reason for developing a high-pressure steam engine was to make the Watt engine both more compact and also more efficient. Early steamboat engineers used a low-pressure steam engine for fear of boiler explosions. As a result, the engine of the early boats was exactly what Trevithick wanted to overcome. They were both less efficient and took up space that could best be used for cargo, and Henry Miller Shreve recognized that fact. Shreve would use a high-pressure steam engine with two boilers that could drive two paddles independently on the boat that he designed and named for his father's good friend, George Washington. Most of the older drawings depict the Washington as a side wheeler with no pilot house. The lack of a pilot house made me believe the drawings were inaccurate. Because Shreve was an experienced riverman, he realized the importance of a high pilot house on such a long boat with little to no visibility around the lower decks. I believe that this model built by John Bowman of the site Wheeling Built Steamboats is the correct design. The Washington was built in Wheeling, Western Virginia, which is now the state of West Virginia. Notice that the Washington is a stern wheeler. Extending the paddle wheels over the sides of the boat widened the boat and limited them to larger waterways. Placing the side wheels within the insets on the port and starboard sides, as many boats would do, the width problem was taken care of, but at the cost of deck space for cargo. On a stern drive, two paddle wheels would extend from the center of the boat out to each side. Being extended off the end of the boat, the paddles would have much wider paddle boards, putting more surface area into the water. The paddles, being independent of each other, gave the boat more maneuverability by allowing the paddles to operate counter to one another. Side wheels did give the pilot an advantage when turning the boat in place, because the pivot point was near the center of the boat as opposed to off the stern on a stern drive. The Washington was a shallow draft vessel with two decks. The lower one was for the machinery and cargo, and the second for passengers. The steam engine cylinders were horizontal and drove the paddle wheels like an automobile piston drives a crankshaft. The weight of the cargo and machinery would serve as ballast to keep the boat from being top-heavy. Up high above the second deck was the pilot house, from which the pilot could see well ahead and look for sawyers and snags, or look all around to monitor the position of other boat traffic which the Washington was sharing the river with. This drawing of a latter period Shreve designed boat shows how shallow draft his design was, keeping the boat well above many submerged hazards. Because the boat could run so shallow, a port wouldn't need a dock on which the steamboat would tie up. Most steamboat ports were gently sloping mud banks on which the pilot could run the steamboat aground. The ramp extending above the bow was not called a gangplank, as they were referred to on ships, but as a stage on the steamboats. Once run aground, the stage would be dropped, and the roustabouts, or cotton stackers, began carrying delivered cargo off board and cargo to be shipped on board. The vessel on the drawing depicts a steamboat built around or after 1845. As Shreve commissioned new steamboats to be built, he would name the passenger quarters after new states that had entered the Union. The passenger quarters became known as staterooms. Around 1845, Shreve was building his first boat to have a third deck. Texas came into the Union at that time. He designated the third deck the Texas deck. Because Shreve was the first steamboat captain to use a high-pressure steam engine, he was also the first to have a boiler explosion. But Shreve was a very innovative man, and the explosion inspired him. In the field making repairs, he developed the steam engine pop-off valve, a device so effective that a valve failure was never blamed for a boiler explosion. Pretty much every boiler explosion that took place was due to gross negligence of the crew. To reach high speeds, the safety valve would be tied down to keep it from popping open at its rated pressure. Shreve took the Washington on his first voyage to New Orleans in 1817, and there he challenged the monopoly of the Fulton Livingston Steamboat Company. Leaving New Orleans, he traveled back to Louisville in 25 days, making it in the same time that he had made it in the Enterprise. But this time he did it negotiating the swift currents in the main channel. In Louisville, he learned that Judge Dominique C. Hall had ruled that Louisiana courts had no jurisdiction in enforcing a monopoly in Louisiana waters. The decision effectively eliminated the monopoly and opened the western rivers to competition between many boat companies, creating an economic boom in western rivers transportation. The western rivers became a highway for people moving goods to market on the steamboats, as well as pioneers moving west. In the early days, they still shared the river with keelboats and flatboats. I've always had a fondness for art depicting southern river culture, and I found this one very interesting, for in the background is the town that I believe to be the most historically authentic town in Louisiana. It isn't the town by the river, that is Bayou Sarah, and it would be classified as a ghost town now, for it was taken away by the river. There was once a ferry in Bayou Sarah connecting the town of New Roads, a town that grew up from the French settlement of Point Coupee. A new bridge has bypassed it, but on the Lurse soil hill is St. Francisville, beautifully forested now in a variety of southern species of trees. When the city was settled, the goal there was to farm the Lurse soil. The Lurse bluffs were created from wind-drifted silt blown out of the western river valley in ancient times. The most fertile soil in Louisiana is the most erodible soil as well. Farming didn't last long there because of the creation of ravines through the area. Reforestation corrected the problem and created what is, in my opinion, the most beautiful town in Louisiana. To fuel the transportation revolution, woodlots sprang up along rivers, and farmers subsidized their incomes by providing wood to keep the engines burning and the paddle wheels turning. Captain Henry Miller Shreve was a man that knew engineering, understood the challenges of the river navigation, and was also a businessman. He had been a trapper at a young age, and as an adult bought goods to be shipped on his keelboat to be sold in New Orleans. Captain Shreve was not typical. Most captains were businessmen, knowing very little about either the mechanics of the vessel or the challenges of the river. They were very dependent on their pilots and engineers. Many of the pilots were keelboat crewmen, but many, such as Samuel Clemens, were young men who grew up on the river and yearned for a life of adventure on the western rivers. The pilot had to know the hazards of every section of the river. He learned much from pilot notes taken on the river by other pilots, and as a pilot, he was responsible for noting all the new hazards as they popped up. Piloting was a job of great responsibility. Samuel Clemens became famous as the author Mark Twain. Mark Twain was a sounding call when using lines to check the depths of the river. When the sounding line showed 2 fathoms or 12 feet, then a call of Mark Twain was shouted, indicating the boat was at a safe depth. While Mark Twain has written some wonderful fiction, my favorite of his works is Life on the Mississippi, the story of his life as a riverboat pilot. Farm boys of early America were like the farm boys of today. To stay in business, they had to keep things working, and that meant they knew carpentry, mechanics, wheelwrighting, and blacksmithing. While many of them loved working at the skills necessary for keeping the farm going, many of them hated farming itself. Those men were perfect for the position of steamboat engineer. The roustabouts, often called cotton stackers, were slaves not owned outright by the steamboat company, but contracted labor provided by their owners. They were big men capable of lifting heavy cotton bales. They worked hard and they played hard. When they were traveling between ports, they had lots of downtime, and they would group together and gamble or challenge each other in contests of strength and skill. Among the slave class, they were an elite. Not only were they strong and capable men, but having traveled and enjoyed shore leave in many of the large ports of the western rivers, they were considered worldly men as well. Pilots on the western rivers had to keep up with the changes on the rivers that could place them in unexpected danger. With a heavy rain, a tree could slough off into the river, and with the momentum that the great mass acquired while sliding down the slope, could fling itself out into the river before the root mass sank and anchored the tree in place. A tree that stayed in place and didn't move was a snag. One that rocked back and forth was called a sawyer. A snag could puncture the hull. A sawyer could both puncture and rip at the hull. Both obstructions did great damage to the steamboats and even cost many lives. Captain Henry Miller Shreve would use his engineering skills to develop another type of steamboat that would bring greater safety for the boats plying the western rivers.